Now, the rest of the story. Little Tommy had everything that money could buy, and yet the thing he needed most could not be had at any price. Frail, bespectacled, quiet, Tommy was labeled a slow learner, a hopeless dunce. Indeed, until the age of 12, he could not read, not at all. He was read to by family members. He would listen enthralled to the tales of Cooper and Scott and Dickens, but he could not read them nor anything else. Tommy's advantages in life were many. His parents were Southerners, lived in the Deep South all during the Uncivil War and subsequent Reconstruction. Yet not once during that time, while Tommy was growing up, despite the hardships all around them, not once did the family want for the slightest necessity or luxury. Tommy's father was known as an outstanding scholar. More than anything, he wished for a learned son. Tutors were hired. Dad even tried teaching Tommy himself, but the results were always the same. The youngster just never quite caught on. At 13, Tommy was finally reading, but painstakingly. At last, his father surrendered. The boy simply could not absorb knowledge, it seemed, and yet even if Tommy were virtually ineducable, he would at least become a gentleman, and so his dad set out to make him one. Over the years that followed, Tommy was encouraged to rehearse the social graces. In these, he became adept. But all of his life, Tommy was to read with difficulty, and that might have ruined him, except for the rest of the story. Today we call it dyslexia, the inability to organize letters and words on a page and pour them effectively into one's mind. But that was Tommy's problem. Dyslexia may be caused by a number of conditions: brain damage, low intelligence, emotional disorders, even adverse social circumstances. None of these conditions applied to Tommy, so his case is now said to have been one of developmental dyslexia, a highly specific, presumably congenital inability to recognize words and letters easily. Decades before the condition had been identified and described, it made Tommy appear stupid, made him appear actually unable to learn. Today, regarding the condition in general and Tommy in particular, we know differently. But once upon a time, there was a poor little rich boy, a youngster whose learning was limited to the stories read to him by his parents and his sisters. His reputation as ineducable temporarily obscured his natural leadership ability, evident when he was at play with other children. And little might anyone have imagined that the boy's early lack of literary skill forced him to focus on the spoken word, which eventually made him a fine speaker. And there was another quality which Tommy possessed, one that made all the difference: determination. Determination to learn despite his reading difficulties, to become educated at Princeton, to finish law school, to get elected President of the United States. The poor little rich boy, whom nobody thought would amount to anything, was Thomas Woodrow Wilson. And now you know the rest of the story.
And now, the rest of the story. If you've listened to a handful, it'll only take a few, of Mr. Harvey's broadcasts, you may have realized that he tended to focus on people who have achieved great things despite whatever should have held them back. They succeeded because they were determined. They persevered when everything and everyone around them told them to give up. Sometimes their own bodies wanted them to give up. In this case, Woodrow Wilson refused to give up. Thomas Woodrow Wilson was born here in the manse, in what is referred to as the birth room, on December 28, 1856. Now, a manse is a house occupied by a minister of a Presbyterian church. Woodrow's father, Joseph Wilson, was an ordained Presbyterian minister. The manse is now part of the Woodrow Wilson Presidential Library and Birthplace in Stanton, Virginia. The manse is open for tours, so you can come see it for yourself. The car sitting in the front of the manse is Woodrow Wilson's 1919 Pierce Arrow limousine that he used while he was president. Woodrow Wilson had no memory of the manse from his childhood because in 1858, less than 2 years after he was born, Woodrow's family moved when his father began preaching at the Presbyterian Church in Augusta, Georgia. Woodrow visited Stanton throughout his adult life and always referred to the manse as home. Now, I'm always interested to learn why people are named as they are. Let's take a look at Thomas Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson was the third of 4 children born to Joseph Ruggles Wilson and Jessie Janet Woodrow. Woodrow was President Wilson's mother's maiden name. But what about the Thomas part? This was also taken from his mother's side of the family. President Wilson's mother's father was Reverend Thomas Woodrow. Reverend Thomas Woodrow must have been a favored relative for Joseph and Jessie to give their firstborn son his name. Woodrow Wilson said that his earliest memory was from 1860 when he, then 3 years old, was playing near the front gate of their yard of the Augusta parsonage. He overheard a passerby say in a tone of total disgust that Abraham Lincoln had been elected president and war was coming. Now keep in mind, Woodrow Wilson's family was originally from Ohio but was living in Georgia. In February 1861, Georgia was one of 11 states who formed the Confederate States of America and declared secession from the United States. 2 months later, the Civil War began when Confederate troops fired upon the Union-held Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. I want to point out that Woodrow Wilson was just one of 2 American presidents who had been a citizen of the Confederate States of America. The other was John Tyler. Despite a separation of church and state, the split between the North and South spilled over into the Presbyterian Church. In 1861, Woodrow Wilson's father, Joseph, became one of the founders of the Southern Presbyterian Church after it split from the Northern Presbyterians. In 1870, Woodrow Wilson's father moved the family to Columbia, South Carolina, where Joseph was a theology professor at the Columbia Theological Seminary. Now, it must have been difficult for Joseph, a professor, a teacher, unable to help his son with his reading, unable to understand why his son was having difficulty in reading. Woodrow couldn't read at all until he was 12 years old, about the time that the Wilson family moved to Columbia, South Carolina. The idea of dyslexia hadn't been, identified when Woodrow was a child. A person with the problem was said to be a slow learner, a hopeless dunce. Those are just some of the nice terms they used. You can imagine the more colorful ones. Despite his difficulty with reading, Woodrow attended the Davidson College in Davidson, North Carolina in the 1873-74 school year, but he transferred as a freshman to the College of New Jersey, which eventually became Princeton University. Woodrow studied political philosophy and history. Now, 3 decades later, Woodrow became the president of Princeton University. Woodrow was a popular student, a natural leader. He was elected secretary of the school's football association, president of the school's baseball association, and managing editor of the student newspaper. He was a managing editor of the student newspaper despite his reading difficulties. In 1877, when Woodrow was about 20 years old and attending Princeton, German physician Adolf Kussmaul developed the concept of Wortblindheit, which translates to word blindness. Now, he based this on a single case. Dr. Kussmaul thought it was an isolated condition, but other doctors noticed the same condition in their patients, which was an impairment in learning to read and write, although they had normal intellectual and physical abilities in all other respects. 10 years later, in 1887, ophthalmologist Rudolf Berlin combined the Greek word for hard, bad, or difficult, dys, with the Greek word for speech or word, lexis, to form the word we know this condition as today, dyslexia. Now, there are many people whom you may be familiar with who are or were dyslexic. Albert Einstein, Keira Knightley, Orlando Bloom, Richard Branson, Tom Cruise, Cher, Henry Winkler, Steven Spielberg, Jay Leno, Jennifer Aniston, Walt Disney, Keanu Reeves, Anthony Hopkins, Leonardo da Vinci, Robin Williams, and even someone whom Guinness World Records lists as the best-selling fiction writer of all time, Agatha Christie. How can someone be a professional writer with dyslexia? In the past century and a half, there have been great strides in dyslexia research. Researchers have learned that dyslexia is a learning disorder that involves difficulty reading due to problems identifying speech sounds and learning how they relate to letters and words, putting them together. Letters on a page are absolutely meaningless until our brains begin to decode them. Those of us who have never struggled with dyslexia take for granted that we are breaking codes each time we read something. This symbol means this, that symbol means that. Our brains do it so quickly that we don't even realize it. Now that is much, much more difficult for people who struggle with dyslexia. Dyslexia is not due to problems with intelligence, hearing, or vision. It's a result of individual differences in areas of the brain that process language. Now, there's no simple cure for dyslexia. It takes a lot of work. There are medications that can help. Emotional support plays an important role. Don't discourage, but encourage them to continue working to improve their reading skills. There are numerous educational techniques which can help. I'll leave a link in the description to the Mayo Clinic where you can learn more about how to help someone with dyslexia. If Woodrow Wilson reached the highest office in the land despite his struggles with dyslexia, if all of those other people I mentioned can achieve great things despite their struggles with reading, everyone can. Now that goes for anything that might be holding you back. With hard work, you can achieve great things. I'm Brad Dyson. Thanks for watching. And now you know the rest of the story.